That's all it is, Miles. A leap of faith.
I'm about to make an incredibly brave and unheard of claim. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is a very good movie. Yeah, I know. Bold as that claim may be, this movie was undeniably the boldest of its time. It was a film that rejected the proven money-printing model of the Pixar-esque art and animation style in favor of a stylistic approach that cost significantly more time and resources to develop, required a team of animators more than double the size of a typical project, and even then, took over a week just to animate a single second of footage, a quarter of its competition. And it paid off in spades. I'd bet bucks to bagels that you couldn't find someone who walked away from it without finding something that they loved about it. Into the Spider-Verse is a marvelous looking film with a heartwarming story about forging your own path, perseverance, and stepping up for what you love. Its visuals are the most striking of any film in what feels like ages, and not to mention, it's the most refreshing spin on the tried and true Spider-Man story that the franchise has ever had. I would have gone as far as to say it's the best Spider-Man story ever made if it weren't for Insomniac's incredible Spider-Man game from that same year. It is hands down my favorite animated film, and that's saying something considering it doesn't have the benefit of nostalgia to thwip-slap logic from that claim. This amazing Spider-Man film was the ultimate animated movie, to the point where the consensus of animation fans in 2018 was, this is going to revolutionize the animation industry. And we couldn't wait to see what came next. Flash forward, and the second film is coming out in just under a week. And even though that there have been countless videos over the years singing the praises of this film, I figured now would be the best time for me to throw my mask into that ring, because I have something to offer that reviews and analysis at the time simply couldn't have. Retrospective. It's been almost half a decade since Into the Spider-Verse released, and yes, you heard me right, 2018 was 5 years ago. I feel myself withering away just saying that. And with typical project cycles for animated films ranging anywhere between 3 to 7 years, we're now in a position where we can actually take a look at the immediate legacy Into the Spider-Verse has had on the animation industry, as well as look into the reality of that revolution we were all excited for at the time. And while this film may have been revolutionary in its approach to the medium, what if I told you that its impact to the animation industry wasn't a revolution after all? It was a revelation. Make no mistake, when this film first released, it was a game changer. Everyone and their uncle in the animation space was talking about this movie. Its look, its sound, it stood out in the best way possible, capturing the surprise of audiences everywhere, including me, who had absolutely zero expectations from the few trailers I saw of it. It went on to win the first non-Disney Academy Award for Best Animated Film since 2011, and it put Sony Animation, let me say that again, the studio that brought you the Emoji Movie, on the map as an industry leader who could push the boundaries of what was possible with an existing beloved franchise and 3D animation. But when I say Into the Spider-Verse was a revelation, I'm primarily talking about its effect on the animation industry. Its critical success caused films from other studios to shift its visual aesthetic to be more in line with how Into the Spider-Verse was, and this wouldn't be the first time that this happened. It happened all the way back in 1995 when Pixar released the first fully 3D animated film, convincing studios around the globe to start adopting the technology, and in 2001 when disrupted the animation space and convinced Disney, let me say that again, the studio that brought you the frickin' Lion King, to completely abandon their 2D animation department almost entirely, regulating them to produce TV projects as needed and never producing a 2D animated film ever again. A movie that shifted the paradigm like Into the Spider-Verse was sorely needed, following what I consider to be one of the most mediocre years of animated films in the mid-2010s, where even studios as good as Pixar were producing things like The Good Dinosaur. So what does any of this have to do with Into the Spider-Verse? Well, for that, we need to take a step back and look at maybe one of the most overlooked aspects of the modern animation industry: animation. Into the Spider-Verse had this amazingly stylized animation that featured these choppy motions to its characters' movement and this satisfying stretch and fluidity to it. Not to mention a myriad of visually distinctive characters that did more than just over-exaggerate a specific portion of the body or face. All of this was incredibly refreshing and never before attempted by a major studio in the 3D space. But that's the key. In the 3D space. Back in ancient times, aka 1995 and before, animation was almost entirely hand-drawn. So no matter where you were, the process was long and painstaking for it to maintain the same fluidity and immersion of live-action films, because you weren't just drawing a masterpiece for a single second, you had to draw at least 24 masterpieces that all flow consistently into one another, all for just 1 second of footage. This was due to something called the frame rate, or the number of individual frames in a given second. And 24 frames is what's considered the gold standard frame rate for film. Now, for live action, this isn't a problem. Just set the cameras to capture 24 FPS and you'll have footage ready for the editing room just as soon as they stop rolling. But for animators, hand drawing 24 realistically moving images for every second over the course of a feature-length movie was frankly ridiculous. So they took the Scrooge McDuck approach to things.
You've got to work smarter, lad, not harder.
They found ways around this absurd workload, and they did it using something unexpectedly human: psychology. Since we're talking about something visual, think about this. You blink about 15 to 20 times per minute, or between 21,600 and 28,800 times a day. And yet, realistically, you don't feel like you're missing nearly that much visual information when you're out on a nature hike, scrolling through TikTok, or watching a YouTuber over-explain a basic human process. This is because your brain is equipped to fill in gaps of visual information even when stimuli is absent from our eyes, in a process known as filling in. Was this also named during the writer's strike? Anyway, animators figured out pretty quickly that they could exploit this hardwired process and adopted the method of animating on various frame rates to greatly reduce their workloads and even emphasize dramatic motion while doing so. This included animating on 1s, or a new frame of animation every frame, animating on 2s, or a new frame of animation every other frame, animating on 3s, or a new frame every 3 frames of animation, and so on and so forth. This is probably the most well-known animation technique in the industry, and it's sped up workflows greatly. But before we get back into the Spider-Verse, we need to talk about motion. Perhaps the biggest difference between 2D animation and live action is clarity, where oftentimes live action relies on things like motion blur to compensate for quick movements in between frames, compared to 2D animation, where frames are most often clearly defined works of art on every frame. This opened up a realm of opportunity for animators to get jiggy with motion in ways impossible to replicate in real life, but doing so could get out of hand pretty quickly. So, principles of animation were established to help do things like smooth out rapid motion, maintain visual consistency between shots, anticipate character movement, and more, all while allowing animators to do so across various art styles and, importantly, making it where they didn't have to go home at 3 a.m. every night. There are 12 principles, and I won't be going into them, this isn't that kind of a video, and frankly, there are really talented animation channels that could explain them infinitely better than I could. But the point is, the animation industry spent decades developing inventive ways to not only reduce their workloads, but to immerse us in this medium that took these quick-firing pictures and made them into a truly unique experience that, even with all the money in the world, could never be replicated in live action. No matter how hard you try, Disney. Nowadays, we have these fancy schmancy computers to do a lot of the process for us. We don't need to animate on 2s or 3s, or even utilize half of the animation principles developed over the years, because why would we? Let's just have some keyframes that the animators use, and the computer can fill in everything in between. Motion blur exists, so let's just slap that on the in-between frame, make it so realistic. And 3D animation is all about making things look realistic. This was the consensus of every major animation studio for years. And look, you can have absolutely amazing, lifelike looking 3D animated films, and I have no problem with that. But as studios settled into this hard press for lifelike visuals, it quickly became the only thing that animation studios were capable of developing. In an effort to capitalize on a flashy new visual style, the industry became complacent in abandoning what made animation so unique to live action in the first place, and sucked the creativity out of this fundamentally artistic process. To be clear, there were films that pushed the visual envelope, and that's great, but they all had fundamentally the same DNA that made them look like they could have been produced by a rival studio if the viewer was none the wiser. This, of course, is where the team behind Into the Spider-Verse chose to do their own thing. Since they were going off of a character whose roots were deep in comics, they wanted to develop a style that, for once, didn't emulate reality but was visually consistent with a comic book aesthetic. As such, this came with more of a 2.5D look since they were animating in 3D, but all their references were in 2D. You'd think that this would lead to a flat-looking film that didn't gain the benefits of either, but oh, sweet child. This is Chris Miller and Phil Lord we're talking about. You don't miss with Chris Miller and Phil Lord. One of those names belongs to one of these two people. I didn't look it up. They brought those animation principles back from the dead for a look that was quick, squishy, and out of this world. And since it wouldn't have just worked to just copy and paste those 2D principles over this extra dimension, they evolved many of them to be better integrated into their own custom aesthetic. Like, for example, adding 2D ink lines over the 3D art to add to the expressiveness of the characters, or utilizing different tones to emphasize depth of field to compensate for the comic book 2D look. There are countless examples of the art team manipulating traditional visual techniques to fit this brand spanking new art style, and I haven't even scratched the surface of everything that they've done. But something that can be easily forgotten from this honeymoon period with this art style is that it was all done because it had to be done. Necessity of a visual style varies from project to project and even from shot to shot. It's okay to make an animated film that moves on ones if that's what's best for that particular moment. But the difference here is they were actually purposeful in implementing different frame times and those evolved principles depending on what a character or scene actually needed to look its best. They didn't just do things different for the hell of it. If they changed something, then every choice they made mattered. It's because of their careful management and inclusivity of variety that they managed to develop a global art style that cohesively fit characters that were each designed with their own unique styles. Thanks to the cross-patching that they made to represent shadows, they were able to add a completely black and white character that interacted effortlessly with the rest of the film. Or maybe Spider-Ham would be a better example, as he was a cartoon character that was meant to replicate a cartoony style without actually looking cartoony and therefore breaking the overall aesthetic of the film. Do you have any idea how hard that is? Making a cartoon character not look cartoony but feel cartoony? Because I don't. There's not enough therapy in the world that can convince me to undertake something like that. Like I said, this back-to-basics approach was unprecedented in the modern animation landscape when smear frames, of all things, were considered brave for animated movies to use. And I certainly wouldn't have thought Sony, of all companies, would have been the one to pull it off with their less than stellar track record. But credit where credit's due, Sony Animation is the only major studio that would have even dared to attempt something like this. As much as I love DreamWorks, I don't think they would have backed something this risky and expensive. And forget Pixar and Illumination, especially Illumination, oh my god. Into the Spider-Verse was stunning and clearly struck a chord with animation studios, as we now have other major players producing increasingly stylized projects. Wouldn't you know it, just 4 years after Into the Spider-Verse, you had DreamWorks release 2 films, The Bad Guys and Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, both fantastic films that played around with the frame rate and featured a bold new art direction, which was especially surprising for Puss in Boots since it was technically a sequel. And not too long from now, Nickelodeon Animation Animation, of all studios, will be releasing a legitimately incredible looking TMNT movie that'll look to do the same. Beyond that, in as little as 3 years since Into the Spider-Verse, you can see more and more studios trying these amazing new looks for 3D that challenges the status quo, and that's super exciting to see all this diversity to a medium stuck in stagnation for years. With the technology being infinitely more accessible in both time and money compared to traditional 2D animation, which oftentimes required the financial backing of a major studio or immense community support, even a single person can create one of the most visually inventive 3D animations in their spare time in just months. Even Disney, a studio traditionally coy about messing with a money printing formula, has elected to invest in stylizing their 3D films with their upcoming movie Wish, and undoubtedly, Into the Spider-Verse has caused mold-breaking projects like these to advance further than they would have without its existence. Even after all the critical failures over the years, Sony Animation never stopped getting back up. I think fundamentally, Into the Spider-Verse's success was a revelation to studios everywhere that we shouldn't just abandon these foundational animation techniques in favor of trying to replicate reality or create something that clearly distinguished itself from that tired old second dimension, that we should instead strive to take aspects of those techniques from before and evolve them to fit this new one. And Into the Spider-Verse has clearly set a fire into the hearts of animators everywhere to do just that. 2D animation has been coming back in a big way as of late, and has a long history of innovation and success, but 3D animation, by comparison, is just a baby. It hasn't had enough time to evolve itself apart from improving graphics. But if Toy Story was 3D animation's first steps, and Shrek was 3D animation's first words, then Into the Spider-Verse is like its first swear word. Unexpected, spicy as hell, and undoubtedly leading to more after seeing how we reacted to it. Looking at what 3D animated films we have today and coming soon in 2023 compared to what we had just 5 years ago, I'd say we're well on our way to another golden age of 3D animation. One where we can have more visual diversity than we've ever had, and where studios everywhere are willing to innovate the medium because they were shown that not only is it possible, but the writing was on the wall the whole time. Into the Spider-Verse shook the animation industry out of a trance it had been stuck in far too long. And none of it would have been possible without Into the Spider-Verse taking a leap of faith. A spectacular shout out to my Patreons Bajà Blast, Annabelle, and Ravixe. This was my first major foray into something I hadn't tried before, so be sure to let me know if you found it interesting or if you feel like it could improve in any way. I want to get better and make content you'll enjoy, so I'd honestly really appreciate the support by giving me your thoughts in a comment, as well as a like and a sub. Next week I'll have a review of Across the Spider-Verse, and I'm so excited for that I'm gonna start counting, and I'm not gonna stop until my next video comes out. Okay, 1, 2, 3, please subscribe, 4, 5, 6, the people in the theater are gonna hate this, 7, 8, 9...